I know from a couple of interviews, you pick sort of the 2014 starting point for the massive online censorship industry, and I guess maybe I don't know what the internet was like pre 2014. I mean, it was developed, but why is that the important starting date for what you've identified as this government global regime of internet censorship?
Well, because it's the moment that the unalloyed good of free speech diplomacy became a mixed bag. And what I mean by that is the internet was always a tool from its military origins into its, passage off to the National Science Foundation and the World Wide Web. There was always a statecraft aspect of the internet. And in particular, in the early 90s, the State Department, the DoD, the intelligence community became fixed on the idea that free speech diplomacy would be a way to help U.S.-backed assets win elections, help them develop their paramilitary capacity, their popularity, help win the hearts and minds soft power influence war. I've talked about this many times before, but even something as simple as Google. Google was this DARPA grant that Larry Page and Sergey Brin got while they were at Stanford. It was a joint CIA-NSA program. Everyone can look this up on, if you want to do the long version, you could read Surveillance Valley by Yasha Levine. If you want the short version, you can look up the Quartz article about Google's origins lying in CIA, NSA program contracts. And that was for something called the Massive Digital Data Systems Program, whose goal was to track how birds of a feather flock together online, so that the CIA and NSA would have the ability to create a political radar system based on Web 1.0 of the static websites, the blogs, and this is pre-social media. This is 1996. But that they were aggregating the search data, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, with a DARPA coordinator at Stanford. That Google came from R&D from DARPA, but that was free speech work fundamentally. They were piping the internet into the far reaches of human civilization across the globe, and then using that speech, promoting free speech, because a lot of these countries after the Cold War ended, that the U.S. still wanted to pry open their markets, topple their governments, increase U.S. strategic influence. There was state control over media, like Yugoslavia, for example. The first time NATO fired an offensive bullet in 1995 and then 1999, you had state control in large part over media. And so in 1995 through 1999, the State Department was funding all these Serbian dissident groups, was funding these Albanian groups to use the internet in order to popularize their message, because the Yugoslav government could not take it down. And so it was like a propaganda leaflet that could not be put in a paper shredder. And so it was very promising from 1991 up until 2014. And 2014 was that moment where, after the Arab Spring from 2010 to 2012, it was all systems go for free speech, because we had toppled these governments in Facebook and Twitter revolutions. But that was the moment where it's like, wait a second, actually other sides have free speech. The Russians have free speech in eastern Ukraine. That's why our propaganda is not penetrating. And so that's when the focus on censorship really started. And then it came home in 2016.
And so we'll back it up just all the way to 48. You've mentioned this in other podcasts, but that was the year where you could no longer conquer via military conquest.
Yeah.
And so it became sort of the soft influence in terms of establishing or regaining or solidifying global dominance or regional dominance. And so it's an amazing thing. I said it for a while, like, everyone loves free speech until they're in power. And then when other people use that free speech to take them down, they don't like it anymore. And so in the early days, the government is using the free speech of the internet to penetrate areas where there was censorship via government. Yep. It was successful, but then they found, come 2014, that very same free speech was being used to gain popularity, or at least promote ideas that would gain popularity, that would run contrary to what the Western governments had thought should be implemented by way of democracy.
That's exactly it. And it wasn't just Ukraine itself in 2014. It was also, we assassinate Gaddafi, NATO does effectively. The floodgates spill open into Southern Europe with the migrant crisis, as it was sort of known at the time. 2013 to 2015 was this period of intense political mobilization for right-wing populist parties in Europe who were upset at the open borders policies of their countries. And so you had these sort of Trump 2016 adjacent groups all over Europe that were rising to popularity and challenging orthodox politics. You had, the Brexit movement, obviously, in the UK. You had Marine Le Pen in France, Matteo Salvini in Italy, the Vox Party in Spain, AfD Party in Germany, all over. And, we're seeing in Romania now. But
we'll get to Romania.
These same political parties that were campaigning for the most part on stopping open borders immigration were also, by and large, these working class type parties that wanted economic nationalism, and they wanted cheap gas from Russia. And so when 2014 happened, the US State Department and the UK Foreign Office led this big sanctions crusade on Russia in order to try to kill their economy, in order to try to win back Eastern Ukraine and Crimea.
This is after what is referred to as the Maidan Revolution.
Yeah, exactly.
So they've overthrown the democratically elected, but call it not Russia aligned, but certainly not Western aligned president. What was his name? Yanukovych. If they overthrow him, but then there's still a portion that is loyal to or aligns with Russia. And the purpose for trying to crush Russia now, I mean, where is the West? Where are we getting energy from at that time? Or where is Europe getting it from at that time?
Europe was getting the overwhelming majority of, well, actually, I guess at that time it was probably about half. It was like 35% to 50% from Russia.
Okay.
But it was previously almost 100% from Russia. And it was down to about 35, 50 because of about a decade of what's called energy security, energy diplomacy, energy diversification, basically this predecessor to the Burisma story, if you will, and a lot of the origins of censorship across NATO around 2014 in targeting those right-wing populist political movements. That story sort of starts about a decade earlier when Vladimir Putin first started reasserting Russian influence over the former Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe by using what was called gas diplomacy, which was this sort of concept that because Eastern Europe was at that time almost 100% reliant on Russian gas, if they did not do what Putin wanted them to do, Putin could, in theory, turn off the gas and give them, cold winters, shut down their entire industry, crush their economy. This happened in Georgia in 2005, 2006, and in several other places because oligarchs in those countries were making money from these transit fees or from these deals. You had a lot of the oligarchs in these countries begin to become economically beholden to Russia. And so the winds of the Cold War were being reversed in the mid-aughts, but they were primarily in Republican adjacent places where GOP energy stakeholders were mostly focused, which was Georgia, Azerbaijan. There was less of a sort of George Soros energy mafia presence in those countries. So that was why Mitt Romney was pushing Obama from his right on Russia. I mentioned this a bunch of times before, but it is a funny moment to reflect on that in 2012, when Mitt Romney ran against Barack Obama, there was that famous debate quip where Romney is effectively calling Obama a Putin puppet on the debate stage, and Obama shoots back and says, "The 1980s called. They want their foreign policy back." And you can't imagine someone saying that. I mean, Obama was saying the Cold War's over, bro. We love Russia now, because at the time, Hillary Clinton, was brokering these uranium deals with Russia. Obama was caught on a hot mic with
saying we'll have more negotiability after.
Tell Vladimir.
So what did he mean by that? It's like once he gets elected, that he'll be able to negotiate freely because he won't have to worry about the political blowback for not aligning with, but being friendly with Russia.
Right. Well, what he was saying is something that politicians deal with frequently, which is that in order to win the election, he needed to fake like he was a Russia hawk, because the blob, that was his deputy national security advisor, Ben Rhodes' term. I know a lot of people think I invented it. I did not.
It was a 70s horror movie about that thing that keeps eating everything and gets bigger and bigger.
Yes.
Starting with the homeless person and then going to, I forget who else.
Yeah, fitting, right? So he felt like he was being pushed to be a Russia hawk because of the blob, the foreign policy establishment, which wanted to seize Eurasia and all of the natural resources and territory, that stretches essentially from Central Europe, all the way from Germany effectively to Siberia. So he had to sort of fake, he felt, that he was a Russia hawk, but that once the election was over and the headlines didn't matter as much, and it was his second and final term, he could be free to strike deals and to chart a more neutral course. And then, of course, everything blew up 2 years later when Russia helped backstop the separatist movement in eastern Ukraine that did not respect the new coup government from Victoria Nuland and Jeff Pyatt there at the U.S. Embassy. And that's when this whole thing broke open. But the point that I was trying to make there was that you had, it is Ukraine in a certain sense, but you had all these other parties, not just in Ukraine, all the way, UK, France, Italy, Spain, Germany, Finland, Sweden, Latvia, Lithuania, all of these countries had these populist movements that were rising to power. And almost all of them had a domestic policy that was based around nationalism and to some extent maintaining their identity. But adjacent to that was a foreign policy neutralism that was completely inconsistent and at odds with the U.S. sanctions policy. And so the State Department essentially used these new censorship technologies that were being developed at the same time to take out ISIS to say, well, can't we take out hate speech that way? Because these groups are campaigning on open borders, so we can monitor them for hate speech. Can't we do this for domestic extremism? Can't we begin to think of populism as an attack on democracy and use our democracy promotion government programs to target them? And so then when Brexit happened, a year and a half later, and then Trump got elected, it became a worldwide phenomenon.
I remember it, and it makes a whole hell of a lot more sense in retrospect when they blamed Facebook forget Russian interference, whatever. They blamed Trump's election on free speech. They blamed Brexit on free speech, and that if we didn't have access to misinformation, disinformation, none of this would have happened. Well, we'll get into that. I just actually want to flesh out the rabbit hole of the energy issue in Russia. So Europe is getting, at some point 100%, then it goes down to 35 to 50%, not because they're consuming less, but because they're acquiring energy from other countries. Which other countries what do they substitute that portion of the Russian energy for?
Well, a lot of it was, just the North American market. So, about 8-9 years ago, the Permian Basin, the sheer extent of what we have in West Texas, because West Texas, a lot of our geopolitics around Mexico revolve around the huge amount of oil in Mexico and the partnerships with Texas oil companies there. That Texas oil power faction has been a huge block in American politics since Rockefeller. But famously, the Bush family oil ventures, the Dick Cheney world oil ventures. It's always been a big part of our, especially Republican power base. But there came online the capacity to create something called LNG, liquefied natural gas, which is a totally different way of getting gas to a country. There's natural gas pipelines, which are cheap. Gas is a commodity product, so it doesn't matter. There's not really a difference in quality. It's just simply about cost. And natural gas pipelines are very cheap. LNG is when you have to liquefy the gas and then
through pressure, I imagine. So you're actually you're processing a lot more by way of quantity through its condensed liquid form.
Yes, right. And then you can transport it without needing a pipeline. You could put it on a shipping freight. You can put it on a container ship and then ship it across the ocean. And part of this big grand Ukraine energy play has been through the Baltic Strait, connecting to ports in Poland, and then having Poland connect either directly or through Slovakia into Ukraine. And then you can keep the existing gas pipeline architecture that Ukraine has always had, because it's, those gas pipelines go from Russia to Ukraine and then, out west. And so you can keep all that pipeline architecture, but the initial source point would be expensive American LNG, because it's much, much more expensive to, freeze the gas, harvest it 5,000 miles away, freeze it, ship it 5,000 miles, deload it, then ship it into Ukraine, and then put it through the gas pipeline, then just have a gas pipeline running the whole way. And so this, and some of it is Canada, some of it is the UK, the Royal Dutch Shell, now just Shell plays a big part in the story. We're actually seeing a very similar type grand energy play out in Syria right now, with Turkey backing these rebel groups, these Al-Qaeda groups that are now the sitting government of Syria. I expect to see that new plucky, spunky Al-Qaeda spinoff probably green light the Qatar-Turkey $1 billion pipeline that they've been talking about for a long time. And so it's not uncommon to have regime change because of pipeline politics. I mean, this is sort of a tale as old as time in terms of what we use the military to do. You know, I was joking about this the other day because I've been taking on Milton Friedman a little bit lately because he's a guy who's sort of dear to my heart because I grew up with him, and I think a lot of what he did is very inspirational in terms of the ability to articulate.
I know which clip you're going to talk about now. That's the Milton equivalent of Afuero, but which ones he decides to keep.
Right. And so, yes, exactly. It's the OG. Afuera.
He did have the charisma of Malay when he did it, but he's like, keep and close and
yes, close the Department of Education, close the Department of Labor, keep the State Department, keep the Pentagon. And then there's a moment where he's asked about the Department of Energy, and he pauses and he thinks a little bit and he goes, keep it, but fold it under the Department of Defense, because it's really a subsidiary of the Department of Defense. And I think a lot of people who don't really appreciate the meta dynamics of Friedmanism and its utility to the blob in terms of blobcraft, they sort of gloss over that. They're like, oh, okay, keep the Department of Energy, make it more efficient by merging it with they don't even think about why, Milton? Why is the Department of Energy folded under the Department of Defense, which until 1948 was named the Department of War?
Because energy is a source of an issue of national security.
Right. But we're using our Department of War to secure energy, and that dominates the economics of the energy industry. It dominates all of the downstream issues that flow from states of war, including infringements on civil rights and freedom of speech. And so, the story about the energy dynamics of Ukraine and about Burisma and about the public company Naftogaz there, are a story of this military initiative to win the territorial, chess game over who controls Ukraine. And so, Europe was put through this energy diversification austerity, if you will, for 10 years. I mean, this coincided with climate change, interestingly enough. It was right when,
which actually coincides with censorship, oddly enough. And it's all one big tentacle.
Well, Inconvenient Truth from Al Gore came out in 2006, which was the exact moment that, right on the heels of Russia cutting off gas to Georgia. It was effectively born as this massive. I know that it's got roots back in the 60s and 70s, but it became this global issue. The media surround sound, the government really leaning into it, really at the exact moment that there needed to be a energy diversification policy put on Europe to stop the re-rise of Russia and the late in the game losing of the Cold War, which was that all these energy diversification policies included not just expensive LNG, but because LNG is so expensive, there became impositions around different types of energy to compensate, so that you were not completely reliant on the Russians for oil and gas. And Europe did suffer from that. This is not something they wanted to do on their own, but they were reliant on the U.S. for security. They were reliant on the U.S. for economics and trade, and so they were put through it. And the story of Burisma is so interesting to me, because Burisma represented the ability to kind of negotiate with Europe and not have to continue to lose elections or lose popularity by people with grievances over the energy diversification policy, because Ukraine had all this untapped shale. It had all this untapped petro capacity in the eastern part of the state, in the Donbass, as well as offshore in the Black Sea around Crimea.
All of which are territories that are either annexed or under current active hot war disputes.
They're the exact areas, and they were since 2014. In 2014, the eastern side of the state broke away, including Luhansk, Donetsk, and Crimea.
And this is after the Maidan Revolution, where they overthrow the less pro-Western but more pro-Russian president who got elected. Overthrown, but you have the breakaway on the east, which is where the resource-heavy area is, and also the area that tends to be more Russian than Ukrainian.
Right. And this is where all the mining rights were. This is where the future of the country in terms of its utility on the U.S. empire chessboard was. It was the resources in eastern Ukraine. And all of the U.S. companies who were attached commercially to this NATO plan had already made significant investments skating towards where the puck was going.
Infrastructure investments, mining rights. It's amazing, actually, now when you say it, and when everyone's saying, well, just, there'll be a negotiation, they'll relinquish some of the land in the East, and then you hear the West and Ukraine saying, no, absolutely not. Not about the people, not about the land, about the resources.
Right. Well, look, from 2011 to 2013, right in the run-up to the coup, Chevron signed a $10 billion deal with Naftagaz, which is the publicly owned, the state-owned natural gas company, if you will. It's state-owned, like many big utility type companies are. You've got Rosneft, the Russian oil, you've Gazprom, the Russian oil, Petrobras, the Brazil. You've got many companies, many countries, because oil and gas are so critical to their economy, have state ownership over their big oil and gas companies.
I'm wondering about Petro-Canada. Now, I'm from Canada, but I'm fairly certain these are crown corporations or nationalized to some extent.
Yes, right. And sometimes they'll be partially privatized, so the investors will literally get in bed with the government, but sometimes there's a play to fully privatize them. That's what's happening right now with Naftagaz. But Naftagaz is essentially the big feeder, and they're the ones who collect the transit fees through Russia. And so Burisma had these mining and exploration rights in eastern Ukraine and offshore in Crimea. The idea is they harvest it, they pass it on to Naftagaz. Naftagaz passes it on to the rest of Europe. And now you don't need to go through this expensive, diversification thing, which is leading to the rise of right-wing populist parties. And you still have some of that, but you wean Russia off. But now all the money is being collected internally by these Ukrainian entities. So it's a sell to the Ukrainian people. Of course, the catch is, before that happened, they were being forced to privatize it off to Western stakeholders. So this is why George Soros and his investors have been leading the privatization of Naftagaz, so that once Russia's pried off, it's not the Ukrainian people who are making the money from this. It's foreign investors from Wall Street and London. But Burisma was a way to. So I think one of the things I was getting at is, just to sort of, I guess, have a little bit of a peripheral vision about what was going on in the run-up to the coup and what everyone was expecting before Russia surprised the world by backstopping the separatist movement. There is Chevron signed a $10 billion partnership with Naftagaz. Shell, the British major oil and gas company, they signed a matching $10 billion deal with Naftagaz to partner on the profits for the incoming infusion of gas there. Halliburton got all the contract deals for the oil and gas processing for Ukraine. ConocoPhillips. It was just a who's who. I mean, Halliburton, where Dick Cheney was the CEO and president. Chevron, Exxon, by the way, was had partnerships with Naftagaz. Victoria Nuland, 2 months before the coup in Ukraine, when she announced that she'd given $5 billion in financial support to Ukrainian media and civil society organizations in the run-up to the coup, she did that at a U.S. embassy event sponsored by ExxonMobil and Chevron. And so everyone was skating towards where the puck was going, which was that we were going to overthrow the Yanukovych government. We would fully plunder eastern Ukraine's resources. We would privatize Naftagaz so that the whole thing is owned by a combination of Soros, Halliburton, Exxon, Chevron, and Russia would be. We could justify using government resources, billions in government resources, to accomplish this, because it advances U.S. national security, because it neutralizes Russia because it bankrupts them. So there goes their military.
It bankrupts them because they're no longer selling their gas to Europe.
That was the idea.
This, I don't mean to use a hyperbolic. This sounds like economic rape. I mean, it sounds like a bunch of vultures looking at a soon-to-be corpse and saying, how do we divvy up the meat of this country that is Ukraine in a way that absolutely deprives the Ukrainians of the fruits of their own nation?
Well, that's what's frequently. That's the term that's frequently used to describe the U.S. diplomatic operations against Russia in the 1990s. They call it the economic rape of Russia.